Hey and welcome to this Necromancer tank guide. Necro is the best class in the game in terms of survivability. Majority, if not all of the teams that have gotten the hardest achievement in the game, Swashbuckler Supreme, have used Necromancer to deal with Dreadsail Reef's last boss's ridiculous damage. Necromancer have a passive that reduces all damage they take from dots by 15%. Spirit Guardian will reduce all of your damage taken by another 10%. Their ultimate generation is ridiculously high. They have access to the Colossus ultimate, which, while it might seem like it's less needed nowadays because of Archdruid and Turning Tide item sets, is still the most optimal option as it lets your team bring other useful sets. Once again, to save your time, I want to mention that most of the chapters in this video are straight up copied from my other class guides, simply because there was nothing more to add, but I still want to show them for people who came here just for the Necro guide. Gear chapter is identical to that of DK, Enchants or traits are identical to those shown for Nightblade, skills are obviously completely new, champion points are the same as those of a Nightblade. Rays, food, attributes, Mundus and potions are the same as those of a Dragon Knight. And tips chapter has something new. So, let's get started. Gear. I'm using the Wizard's Wardrobe add-on to quickly swap between setups, but I'll also talk about how to set up your gear if you don't want to use that add-on or if you're a console player. We're gonna start with form and content, so dungeons and arenas. Against Trash, your monster set choices are Spolder of Ruin, paired with One Piece Magma Incarnate, most reliable option but reduces your sustain. Archdruid Deverick is in theory the strongest option, but in practice is really bad against Trash because it often backs out on uneven terrain. Encratis if your team has mainly fire damage, but you'll have to slot flame damage abilities, so I would advise against that. Tremor Scale if your damage dealers are in medium armor and they need additional penetration. 5-piece sets you can use are Yolnacrin, very easy to proc. It's best to use it on body since you want it to work on both of your bars. Crimson Oath can be put on body or back bar. Useful if your damage dealers need more penetration, but don't combine it with Tremor Scale, one is enough. Olorim can be put on back bar and is the best option if you don't have a healer with you, providing Magic Courage. Powerful Assault can be put on body or back bar. Its main disadvantage is it requires you to cast an Assault ability. Turning Tide can be put on body if you're not using Archdruid, but its usefulness depends on your group. In an experienced group, this set will most probably proc while the Trash is almost dead. Pearlescent Ward is only slightly worse than Yolnacrin. On your front bar, Vateshran Sword and Board is an absolute winner. It makes stacking ads so much faster. Master Sword and Board is an option if you wanna be safe. My preferred setup is Spolder, Yolnacrin on body, Olorim on back bar, and Vateshran on front bar. Against bosses, your monster set options are all the previously mentioned sets, which are Spolder, Archdruid, Encratis and Tremor Scale, with a few changes. Archdruid becomes reliable because boss fights are usually on flat terrain, so I'd say it's better than Spolder. Encratis' fire damage reduction becomes useful against some bosses, such as Arceus in Stone Garden. I didn't mention that as a benefit against Trash because Trash doesn't hit hard. Nazarai is another good option if you're wearing Turning Tide. It'll also boost Minor Brittle and Major Maim, so you don't have to cast Destructive Clench that often. Since bosses are harder, you can also use some defensive monster sets such as Vykosa, Engine Guardian, Lord Warden or Earthgore. When it comes to 5-piece sets, Turning Tide is the best option on body this time. Yolnacrin is still decent. Olorim is still best if you don't have a healer with Major Courage. Powerful Assault shouldn't be worn on body against harder bosses. It still has the disadvantage of eating up a skill slot, but Vigor isn't that bad anymore because the Resolving Morph gives you Minor Resolve. Crimson Oath is the best option if your DDs don't have enough penetration because they're in medium armor. But again, don't mix it with Tremor Scale. Pearlescent Ward is only slightly worse than Yolnacrin, but it has the advantage of giving you massive mitigation when your group members die, making it easier to recover. On your front bar, Master Sword and Board is the best option by far. My preferred setup is Archdruid, Turning Tide, Olorim and Master Sword and Board. If you can't quickly switch between setups, just stay on your boss setup all the time. Now let's move on to trials. I'll be talking only about unorganized pug runs because in an organized team, a raid will tell you exactly what to wear to support the group. If you're a main tank, the best option is Archdruid, Turning Tide on body, Yolnacrin on back bar, and Master Sword and Board on front bar. If you run off tank, the best option is Spolder or Encratis as your monster set, Saxhleel, Pearlescent Ward or Crimson Oath on body, Powerful Assault on back bar, and Master Sword and Board on front bar. Once again, these are setups for unorganized groups. Archdruid and Turning Tide become less useful in organized groups where Major Wound can be taken care of by 2 Colossi ults and a healer with Nazarai and Pearls. Once you feel comfortable enough, you can start using double Ice Staff setups on some fights. In that case, if you've had Yolna on back bar, you'll now have to move Yolna to front bar, since that's where your Destructive Clench will be. Here's an example of main tank setup with Ice Staves, off tank setup, and off tank setup with Ice Staves. What to do if you don't have those sets? If you're a complete beginner, use crafted sets such as Fortified Brass, Heartland Conqueror, or Serpent's Disdain. You can use Death's Wind or any set that has 2-piece armor bonus on your weapons. Here is an example setup. What if you haven't gotten into trials yet? In dungeons, I've shown enough options to make a setup without trial gear. You can, for example, use Turning Tide on body and Powerful Assault backbar throughout the entire dungeon. In trials, if you're missing a trial gear, just use anything over it. The crafted setup I've shown before is enough to clear any normal instance of any trial, so you can farm the non-perfected version of, for example, Yolnacrin using your crafted setup before you go into Veteran's Aspire to get the perfected one. Enchants. On body, the best enchant is Prismatic Defense. If you can't afford it, use a mix of health, stamina and magicka enchants. On jewelry, the best enchant will depend on your skills. Most of the time I found magicka cost reduction to be the most useful, but tri cost reduction can be better if you have some stamina skills. If you're a beginner, you can also use a single block cost reduction enchant. If you wanna see more explanations why these are my choices, I made a separate video about it. On weapons, if you're using sword and board on your front bar, the choice depends on the trait of your weapon. If it's charged, you can use shock enchant to proc minor vulnerability, but this will be useless if you have a warden already applying minor vulnerability with their fetcher. If you're not using charged weapon, then you can use either a weakening enchant or sustain poison. If you have an ice staff on your front bar, I'm gonna assume you have charged trait. The choices are Absorb Stamina enchant. It will proc minor breach, which you'll lack because you don't have access to pierce armor anymore. But it can also be applied by Templar's Power of the Light or Damage Dealer's Physical Damage. Frost enchant. It will proc minor brittle, which means you won't have to cast Destructive Clench that often. Shock enchant. It will proc minor vulnerability, but in my opinion most of the time it will be useless. Double Ice Staff is a setup you use in more optimized groups, and there you'll have someone else taking care of minor vulnerability. On your backbar weapon, which will always be an Ice Staff, you want Crusher enchant. Traits. Reinforce combined with Divines provides around 4% damage mitigation and 84 magicka recovery if you're using Gachonak Mundus, and it is the best setup overall, with other traits outperforming it only in rare situations. Story Day can be useful for beginners who block a lot of attacks they don't have to block, but in my opinion it's not worth using at all, since it will be a hassle to swap everything once you learn how to play. It's much better to go with the Reinforced Divine setup and use a block cost enchant, which you can easily swap out later. Well fitted can also be useful in niche situations. For jewelry, the best trait is Infused. You can also use Swift in trash fights. Once again, if you wanna see explanations why, go see my video about jewelry. For weapons, the trait on your one-handed weapon should be Charged, Decisive, or Defending. I'd say Charge is the best overall. Decisive can be good in trials where all of the debuffs you could apply with enchants are already covered by other people. Defending will give you around 4% damage mitigation, so it's a good defensive option. If your front bar weapon is an Ice Staff, then Charge is the best option. On your backbar weapon, which will always be an Ice Staff, you should use Infused trait. Skills. Just like with gear, I'm gonna go over multiple setups between which you can swap using add-ons. And I'll also mention how to set up your skills if you're not going to swap at all. This is the skill setup against trash packs in dungeons. Your first priority is using Destructive Clench to taunt dangerous adds. If there are none, you can skip that and start with the next step, throwing caltrops. Then, drop Elemental Blockade, use Power Slam to trigger Vatish Run, and use Pulsar to snare all the smaller enemies. Chain in enemies that didn't get hit by Void Bash. After that, just keep up debuffs on the big enemies. Make sure to pierce armor big adds to apply Minor Breach. That's only supposed to be some rough guideline, so you're not completely clueless on what to do. You'll always get better results by thinking for yourself. You can also use Unnerving Boneyard instead of Caltrops as your source of AoE Major Breach. It has the advantage of granting a synergy, but I personally prefer Caltrops because they have a long travel time, so I can pre-place them while running into a trash pack without pulling them early. If you try to do the same with Boneyard, it will hit them instantly and they will scatter around before you can reach them. If you don't have Vatish Run Sword and Board, Power Slam is useless, so instead you can slot, for example, Revealing Flare. This is the base skill setup against bosses in dungeons. Blast Bones' purpose is creating corpses which you can later sack with Necrotic Potency for ultimate. Blast Bones is also the first skill to replace if you need to slot defensive skills, because if you're struggling with survival, then you won't have time to cast it anyway. Spirit Guardian can be moved to backbar if you need more space for defensive skills on your front bar. Mystic Orb might not be needed if another group member already uses it. Same thing with Overflowing Altar. You don't need a second one if your healer is already providing it. Most of the time, Beckoning Armor will be better than Summoner's Armor. You can also use Balance if you need more Magicka sustain. But the reason I think Beckoning Armor is better is it generates a corpse, which means 6 ultimate per cast, and it activates your Disdain Harm passive. Without it, you'll have to rely on Hungry Scythe and Necrotic Potency to proc it. The two utility skills which you can swap in are Chains and Crushing Shock. If you don't want to have multiple boss setups, then replace Orb with Chains, since ending up without Chains in a fight where you need to pull in adds will be horrible. The defensive skills which you can swap in are Revealing Flare, Resolving Vigor, Immovable and Defensive Stance. Remember that if you're using Powerful Assault, you'll have to slot Vigor even if you don't need additional defensive skill. Here's the setup for Trash and bosses if you absolutely don't want to swap anything. Keep in mind you'll still need Crushing Shock and Immovable for some fights, but those are so rare you can just take your time and slot them manually when you encounter those. This is the setup for Trash and Trials. Ruinous Scythe is technically an option if your team needs off balance, but in my opinion it's never worth it. It greatly reduces your survivability and can be easily provided by someone else. Exploiter CP, which is what makes off balance useful in the first place, is only ever useful in Trash because it's only effective in very short fights. And in Trash you can just make your healer use Lightning Staff or switch to Lightning Staff yourself. This is the base skill setup against bosses and Trials. You can apply everything as said about dungeon setups here. You won't need Mystic Orb nor Overflowing Altar, because you'll always have a healer in Trial. Here Summoner's Armor can be better than Beckoning Armor depending on the fight. And on Zalvaka fight, for example, you absolutely should not use Beckoning Armor, because chaining in Watchers at the wrong time can wipe your group. The 3 ultimates you can use are Aggressive Horn, best for improving group's DPS in dungeons, Reviving Barrier, best for helping a group survive, or Colossus, best for improving group's DPS in Trials, because there you'll have other supports using Horn. If you commit to using only one of those, then you'll have a free slot on your front bar, and you can slot Temporal Guard there, which will passively grant you minor protection, reducing your damage taken by 5%. Just because I didn't mention some skill doesn't mean you shouldn't use it. There's way too many utility skills that will be useful in some rare occasions, such as Expunge or Race Against Time, and it's impossible for me to cover every possibility. Champion points. In the red tree for Trash, a setup of Boundless Vitality, Fortified, Rejuvenation and Celerity is almost always best. For bosses you get more options. My default setup for bosses is Boundless Vitality, Fortified, Rejuvenation and Bracing Anchor, and depending on encounter other useful CPs are Celerity, Sustained by Suffering and On Guard. Which slotables you're gonna unslot to feed these depends on the encounter and the type of damage you'll be taking. For example, against max HP based dots, such as Fight, the best setup will be Fortified, Sustained by Suffering, Rejuvenation and Celerity. Against blockable direct damage, such as the Warrior fight, the best setup will be Boundless Vitality, Fortified, Rejuvenation and Bracing Anchor. In the blue tree, your base setup should be the 4 mitigation CPs, which are Ironclad, Duelist's Rebuff, Enduring Resolve and Unassailable. But that's just the base and you can get more out of it if you prepare for each fight. Because most of the fights in this game don't have all 4 of these damage types. The 2 other useful slotables are Bulwark and Focused Mending. So let's take main tanking Bassi as an example again. You can throw away Unassailable because you don't need Area of Effect damage reduction. And you can throw away Ironclad because even though there will be some direct damage attacks, most of the damage will come from the dot. So you'd end up with Duelist Rebuff, Enduring Resolve, Bulwark and Focused Mending. Race. Unfortunately the races are not balanced at all, and Nord is much better than anything else, and the difference is not small, it's about 7% damage mitigation. You can of course change the build a bit on other races to get more armor, but then you lose sustain. Pick Nord if all you care about is performance, otherwise just pick any race that looks cool to you. Food. The best food is Orzorga Smoked Bear Haunch, but it's expensive. Julius of Misrule provides slightly lower stats and are way cheaper. When main tanking Cloud Rest in Execute you will want to lower your max HP, so you will switch to Candid Jester Coin. Attributes. Most of the time it's best to put all your points into health. It'll increase your survivability and increase scaling on some of your abilities. Having bigger resource capacity is useful but not at the cost of health. If you're playing a race with racial bonus to maximum magicka, you'll have to put some points into stamina to make sure it's higher than magicka so that stamina is your dominant resource. Mundus. Most of the time the Yachanak, which increases your magicka recovery, is the most useful. If you didn't choose Nord as your race, then the Lady, which increases your armor, is also an option to make up for missing armor. The Steed, which increases your movement speed, can also be useful in places such as Cloudress, but it's not necessary. Potions. Most of the time you want to use the Trisat potion, which restores all of your resources and boosts their recoveries by 30%. You can craft it by combining Columbine, Baglos and Mountain Flower. A better alternative, though much more expensive, is Heroism Potion, which boosts your ultimate generation instead of restoring health. You can craft it by combining Columbine, Dragon's Blood and Dragon Realm. Tips. If you're using Sword and Board, make sure not to bar swap right after casting Destructive Clench. Minor Brittle can only be applied while wielding Ice Staff, so if you swap to your one hand and shield bar before projectile hits the enemy, you won't apply it. Corpse generating abilities such as Bone Armor, Spirit Mender or Skeletal Mage generate a corpse when they expire, but they will also generate a corpse if you recast them after half of their duration has passed. So you can use that to generate even more ultimate. Also, do not put a point in Tri-Focus passive. That's all I have to say about Necromancer tank. If you have any more questions, feel free to ask in the comments, and if you want to see more of my content, you can subscribe to my channel. See you in the next video.